Hello, my name's Eduardo, and today we're going to be continuing our reading of Marxist Leninist perspectives on Black liberation and socialism by Frank Chapman. Chapter 1: Capitalism, Slavery, and Revolution. Before even starting this inquiry, it is important to set forth at the outset our method of investigation and presentation of the subject. In approaching our subject, that is, the question of the history of the relationship between Black liberation and socialism, we make full use of the principles and methods of historical investigation, first elaborated and developed by Karl Marx and Frederick Engels. When we look at history, we see that it is a multifaceted process involving wars, class struggles, and the clash of ideas. Further investigation reveals that history is also a law-governed process. Therefore, the approach we have decided to use to find our way through the tangle of social phenomena we are about to examine is called the materialist approach, or historical materialism. Historical materialism, as a doctrine, teaches us that, in the most general or abstract sense, laws of social development are also the laws of nature. Because, in the final analysis, human society is an integral part of nature and is therefore constantly interacting with nature. Yet, there is a critical difference between the way nature develops and society develops. Nature, non-human nature, develops spontaneously and not according to any design or the dictates of conscious forces. Society is made up of people who have intelligence and a conscience, will act to formulate ideas and change things according to their ideas. In other words, people consciously set forth objectives, parentheses, goals, and through trial and error achieve them. Therefore, it is only natural for us to assume that society in general is governed by human reason, by ideas set forth by human beings. In fact, the prelude to the French Revolution was the Age of Reason, where the philosophers of that enlightened era believed that our social being was determined by our ideas. Karl Marx, born and maturing in the era of the French Revolution, demonstrated that this assumption is wrong. His demonstration was based on the truth that before people have ideas, they must have food, clothing, and shelter. There must be basic fulfillment of human needs for society to exist, reproduce itself, and develop. The material life of human beings is based on hunting, gathering, fishing, tilling the soil, making clothes, and building shelters. The means for doing this production is tools. Said tools are created and used by the expenditure of human labor power. Products of labor are exchanged. Such is the material life of people, which is governed by laws of its own, operating independent of human consciousness. These laws determine the objective social relations people have with one another. This means that in all human societies, labor is the natural, necessary condition of social life. People not only hunt, fish, and farm, they produce the tools, their own means for hunting, etc. One might say that a lion's tools are its claws and teeth. Not so with humans, who use tools as a means of acquiring and producing their food apart from and as an extension of their bodies. People do not distinguish themselves from animals by consciousness or language, but by the fact that they, parentheses, people, produce their own means of subsistence apart from their biological makeup. The general laws of the historical development of human societies were first discovered by Karl Marx through his painstaking study of classical German philosophy, French socialism, and British political economy. According to Engels, it was Marx who discovered and formulated the general laws of social development and laid the foundation for scientific socialism. Here is Marx's classical summary of his discovery. Quote, "In the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations which are independent of their will, namely relations of production appropriate to a given stage in the development of their material forces of production. The totality of these relations of production constitute the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. At a certain stage of development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, or this merely expresses the same thing in legal terms, with the property relations within the framework of which they have operated hitherto. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins an era of social revolution. The changes in economic foundation lead sooner or later to the transformation of the whole immense superstructure. In studying such transformations, it is always necessary to distinguish between the material transformation of the economic conditions of production, which can be determined with the precision of natural science, and the legal, political, religious, artistic, or philosophic. In short, ideological forms in which men become conscious of this conflict and fight it out. Just as one does not judge an individual by what he thinks about himself, so one cannot judge such a period of transformation by its consciousness. But on the contrary, this consciousness must be explained from the contradictions of material life, from the conflict existing between the social forces of production and the relations of production. End quote. In studying political economy, Marx did not concern himself with the laws of nature. To investigate those is the business of physics, chemistry, geology, and biology, not of political economy. Also, neither Marx nor Engels were preoccupied with investigating what elements of the modes of production are common to all people. As such, an investigation could, for the most part, only result in acknowledging such obvious things as man always needs tools, land, and food in order to be able to produce at all. Marx and Engels investigated the laws of movement of capitalism as a definite form of social production, peculiar to a definite historical period and to particular European nations. Karl Marx was also the first to show how modern capitalism as a system of political economy was a consequence of the phenomenal growth of merchant capital during that period when direct slavery in European colonies and African slavery became the basis for worldwide commerce based on the commoditization of labor and the exportation of commodities. During this period of commercial warfare between the colonial powers, slavery played a key role in bringing about the advent of industrial capitalists, i.e., slavery provided the financial basis for the Industrial Revolution. In that section of Marx's Capital, dealing with the historical period preceding the revolutionary emergence of industrial capitalism, it is stated, quote, "The money capital formed by means of usury and commerce was prevented from turning into industrial capital. In the country by the feudal constitution, in the towns by the guild organizations. These fetters vanished with the dissolution of feudal society, with the exportation and partial eviction of the country population. The new manufacturers were established at seaports or at inland points beyond the control of the old municipalities and their guilds. Hence, in England, an embittered struggle of the corporate towns against these new industrial nurseries. The discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the Aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, and the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of blackskins signaled the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. The idyllic proceedings are the chief moment of primitive accumulation. On the heels treads the commercial war of the European nations, with the globe for a theater. It begins with the revolt of the Netherlands from Spain, assuming giant dimensions in England's anti-Jacobin war, and is still going on in the Opium Wars against China, end quote. Even before he wrote Capital, Marx had, as early as 1847, come to an understanding of how capitalism and slavery were fundamentally related. He set forth these propositions with remarkable clarity in his polemic against Pierre Proudhon in The Poverty of Philosophy. Here is how Marx stated it. Quote, "Slavery is an economic category like any other. Needless to say, we are dealing only with direct slavery, with Negro slavery in Suriname, in Brazil, in the southern states of North America. Direct slavery is the pivot of our industrialism today, as much as machinery, credit, etc. Without slavery, you would have no cotton. Without cotton, you would have no modern industry. It is slavery that has given value to the colonies. It is the colonies that created world trade. It is world trade that is the necessary condition for large-scale machine industry. Thus, slavery is an economic category of the greatest importance. Without slavery, North America, the most progressive of the countries, would be transformed into a patriarchal country. Wipe North America off the map of the world, and you will have anarchy, the complete decay of modern commerce and civilization. Cause slavery to disappear, and you will have wiped America off the map of nations. Thus, slavery, because it is an economic category, has always existed among the institutions of nations. Modern nations have been able only to disguise slavery in their own countries, but they have imposed it without disguise upon the New World. End quote. English seaport towns like Liverpool, which were like little nurseries of industrial capital, waxed fat off profits accumulated from the African slave trade. During this period, the superexploitation of black labor was the main ingredient driving the process of capitalist development. The African slave trade was commercial warfare on a global scale. The African slavery, with all its horrors, fed the revolutionary process of merchant capital, qualitatively transforming it into industrial capital, and thus bringing to a decisive end the era of feudalism. Through economic transformation and political revolution, feudalism, as the dominant mode of production, is decisively overthrown. During the period of primitive accumulation of capital, slavery was crucial to the creation of world trade, as we have pointed out above. But when the qualitative leap to industrial capitalism becomes a fait accompli, slavery becomes a fetter to the further development of capitalism. The more advanced sections of industrial capitalist class in England become the advocates of the abolition of slavery, forming temporary but tenuous alliances with black people fighting for their freedom throughout the British Empire, and indeed everywhere where they were enslaved. During the period of mercantile capitalism, when slavery was the source of enormous profits, the call for the abolition of slavery was weak, but slave rebellions were rife. Slave rebellions took place along the long march from the African interior to the slave coast, in the belly of slave ships, and on the plantations throughout South America, the Caribbean islands, Central and North America. The greatest lie that the living ever told on the dead is that slaves peacefully submitted to slavery. Dr. Gerald Horne, one of the most prolific historians of our time, speaks directly to this point in his book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776. He wrote, quote, "Slavery fueled a rising capitalism. However, ironically, breaking the bonds of slavery was necessary if capitalism was to realize its full potential, not least since enslaved Africans were fiercely determined to destroy the wealth they were creating, along with the lords of the lash. Contradictorily, slavery was both the boost to nascent capitalism and ultimately a fetter on its productive force. More than this, chattel slavery, grounded in racist chauvinism of a uniquely Republican and toxic type, was one of the more profound human rights violations of the previous millennium, to the extent that 1776 gave such slavery a renewed lease on life, was truly a linear ancestor of 1861, and thus a counter-revolution of slavery," end quote. Once industrial capital ushered in the factory system, which needs a landless peasant population to transform into the proletariat, then the material conditions for the abolition of slavery were full blown. It was a cycle or dialectical spiral that developed in this fashion. Slavery, pure and simple, became the basis for a distinguished wage slavery of the expropriated peasant populations of Europe, and wage slavery, parentheses, so-called free labor, became the economic, parentheses, material basis for the abolition of the slave trade and chattel slavery. In the embryonic period of the Black Liberation Movement, their emergence and alliance between the white bourgeois-led abolitionist movement and black people in the fight to end slavery. By the end of this period, parentheses, i.e., the U.S. Civil War and the smashing of the slaveholders' rebellion, the Black Liberation Movement, though still in its infancy, takes on the additional task of becoming a part of the growing working class movement in the fight for socialism, while at the same time raising the question of self-determination and developing a national consciousness. As early as 1808, black workers in the North organized the New York African Society of Mutual Relief, and later went on to organize the Coachman's Benevolent Society, and in 1820, the Humane Mechanics in Philadelphia. These were clearly black working class organizations, yet they practically addressed the concerns of black people. While black people didn't form a Black People's Abolitionist Society, they did have their own approach, and through their churches, they convened the Colored Convention Movement, the Underground Railroad, the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Movement, and Frederick Douglass's newspaper known as the North Star. Howard Zinn, in his A People's History of the United States, writes, quote, "Blacks had to struggle constantly with the unconscious racism of white abolitionists. They also had to insist on their own independent voice." Douglass wrote for William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, but in 1847 started his own newspaper in Rochester, which led to a break with Garrison. In 1854, the Conference of Negroes declared, "It is emphatically our battle. No one else can fight it for us. Our relations to the anti-slavery movement must be and are changed. Instead of depending upon it, we must lead it," end quote. In an editorial for the first edition of the North Star, Douglass stated unequivocally why the abolitionist movement had to be black-led. We are now about to assume the management of the editorial department of a newspaper devoted to the cause of liberty, humanity, and progress. The position is one which, with the purest motives, we have long desired to occupy. It has long been our anxious wish to see, in this slave-holding, slave-trading, and Negro-hating land, a printing press and paper permanently established under the complete control and direction of the immediate victims of slavery and oppression, end quote. Although during this period, there is no evidence that we know of that black people are consciously taking up the question of socialism, there is no reason to think that the international socialist movement, led by communists, parentheses Marx, Engels, Wade Meyer, and others, was without influence. Herbert Aptheker, says Frederick Douglass, had a bust of Ludwig Feuerbach in his home. Marx was a frequent writer in the Herald Tribune, and Douglass was a frequent reader. At any rate, nothing expresses Douglass's incisive dialectical analysis better than his own words. In 1864, he wrote, quote, "I end where I began. No war but abolition war. No peace but abolition peace. Liberty for all. Chains for none. The black man, a soldier in war, a laborer in peace, a voter in the South, as well as the North. America, his permanent home, and all Americans, his fellow countrymen, such fellow citizens, is my idea of the mission of the war." End quote. From the moment that the insurgent slaveholders fired on Fort Sumter, Frederick Douglass stepped forward as one of the foremost revolutionary figures of the nation, because he spoke for and represented his enslaved people, and the most determined revolutionary force of the abolition of slavery. Unlike President Lincoln and the Northern political leadership, Douglass did not waver or become stuck in paralyzing compromise, but recognized from the outset that the abolition of slavery had to be the key political objective of the Civil War. Whether they were consciously aware of it or not, the black leaders of the abolitionist movement and the communist leaders of the First International agreed on what the political objective of the Civil War was. And they further agreed as to the revolutionary methods for achieving that political objective. I hope you enjoyed that reading. You can find a link to the book in the description below. Let me know if you found this helpful in the comments and if I should continue recording an audiobook for this.